She's refusing to be introduced, but we very proudly call her our own, our Chancellor, Mary Robinson. And I'd just say one thing, the first woman president of Ireland, and who did her own smashing of glass ceilings.
Thank you, Linda. And as you can see, Madam President, Hilary, we have a great audience here. I always think, I'm sure you do too, if you are lucky enough to get a standing ovation at the very beginning, you also want one at the end, don't you? And you got both. And I want to come back to your quote, try again, fail better. This could sum up your resilience. Where do you get your self-belief and resilience from?
Oh, my goodness, Mary. You know, I really believe primarily from my mother. Mm-hmm. And my mother had a very difficult life. She was neglected by her two young parents. They sent her and her little sister to live with grandparents in California, which meant putting these two little girls, 8 and 5, on a train by themselves. And her grandparents were not much in the way of nurturing, and very, very difficult. So by the age of 13, she was out working as a housekeeper. In someone else's home, living there, taking care of the children, doing the housework. And I didn't know any of this when I was a little girl, but as I became older and I learned more about her life, I asked her how she survived that. How did she keep going? And she told me, she said at critical points in her life, people showed her kindness. Mm-hmm. Never underestimate the power of kindness. The first grade teacher who saw she never had anything to eat began bringing extra food, and without embarrassing her, saying, "Oh, Dorothy, I brought too much food." And sharing her food and doing that literally for the entire year. Or even the woman she worked for who said, "We know you want to go to high school, so if you can get up early, get your chores done, you can go to high school and then come back and do the evening chores." That sounds harsh for a 13, 14-year-old, but for my mother, it was a great gift of kindness because she wanted to go to high school. And my mother always said to me, she said, "Look, everybody in life gets knocked down. The question is whether you get back up and keep going." It sounds simple, but it was just emblazoned on my heart. And so for everything I've ever done or ever accomplished, and the failures as well as the successes, really, I think she was the one who put me on that path.
Okay, thank you. And you've challenged students here in Trinity in that very inspiring and I thought very hopeful speech, which I was pleased to hear. You've challenged to actually believe in and work for democracy. We've done some experimenting of an interesting sort in this country. We have a citizens' assembly now of ordinary citizens who are gathered, and they discuss very difficult issues, and they get help, experts come and talk, and they deliberate. And we had two very interesting outcomes from that, one of which we've implemented. We had a very strong message about the need to remove the Eighth Amendment and address the issue of abortion. And it startled the politicians, more or less. They were very surprised that ordinary citizens would come out with this. And I think it led to a very good process that ended up with the referendum. And the extraordinary thing was that the voting was not a divide between the city and the rural areas, but around the country, only one county didn't actually vote. And I think that was vote for removing the Eighth Amendment. But that Citizens' Amendment, Citizens' Assembly has also recommended that we do something on climate change, which I hope will be taken up more seriously by our government. But I wanted to ask you, what kind of opportunities for more meaningful participation can you think of for young people to refresh democracy?
Well, I love the idea of the Citizens' Assembly, and from Dublin, I'm going to Wales, going to Swansea, and one of the reasons is because Wales has adopted a sort of children's assembly, young people's assembly idea. So I really think we have to create these openings for people of all ages, including children and young people, to feel as though they are debating the issues, they are having to wrestle with the trade-offs that we know so well you must in a democracy, and that they are making recommendations that are treated with respect. It doesn't mean that they will all automatically be accepted, but they will be treated with respect and serve as the basis for a debate. So I would like to see us try to find ways to do that. You know, back in the day in our country, in the early years, there were many civic groups, there were many town halls, people would come to be heard, and that gave the average citizen a chance to have their views recognized without being full-time in politics. And I think we got away from that, unfortunately, and our civic life, there's a great sociologist at Harvard, Robert Putnam, whom some of you may have read, and his most famous work is Bowling Alone. We've gotten away from gathering even in recreational or club-like settings where people can go back and forth, agree or disagree in a respectful way. So, Mary, I would like to see all of us find ways to do more of what you're doing with the Citizen Assembly here in Ireland.
Thank you. And now I want to switch to something that I actually admired in your work as Secretary of State. You put great emphasis on the economic empowerment of women. First of all, you know, just briefly, why did you feel that was something you wanted to do? And secondly, do you think it made a difference?
Well, I do think it's made a difference, and here's why. For a long time, I've been concerned about women's rights and opportunities, and trying to think of every argument I could make to convince people in the broader society as well as in governments to take on some of the barriers that held women back. And it struck me when I was a senator back in the early aughts that we needed to make the economic argument, and a number of groups, some public, some private, began doing research. And the upshot of this was that every nation in the world would have a higher gross domestic product. In other words, their economic growth would increase if women were encouraged to enter the workforce in whatever way worked for them at different stages of their lives. And the chart was astonishing because, of course, some countries that have a great deal of obstacles to women participating in the economy, their GDP could have grown 35, 40%. But even in my country, it would have been 9%. Now, what are some of the obstacles? Well, once you get rid of the laws that prohibit women from taking on certain jobs, then you've got to have some kind of family support system, paid leave system, childcare system, a system that enables women to care for their families and work at different points along their way. So I am convinced that the countries that understood this and began to both build up their social supports and knock down remaining barriers have seen positive outcomes. In fact, shortly after he was installed as Prime Minister Abe in Japan contacted me, and I met with him because he looked at all the data, the demographic data in Japan, and they had, as some of you know, a stalled economy for a number of years, but they were not utilizing educated women in their workforce. And so he was trying to think about what were the actions his government could take to enable more women to work. So economic empowerment and economic outcomes, not only good for the individual woman and her family, but actually for the entire economy of a country.
And it is important, as you said, to gather in that evidence. I remember you had a conference in New York to publish a report with your daughter, Chelsea, and with Melinda Gates. And actually, you invited me, among many others, to come, and I think we had a conversation a bit like this in New York. But tell us a bit about that report and the evidence.
Well, this was a report to take stock of where the world was 20 years after the Beijing Conference on Women in 1995.
When you famously said that women's rights are human rights.
That's right. And also, in addition to what I and others said there was a platform for action adopted to really provide more support for women to get the educations that they sought, to get the health care that they needed, to get the economic opportunity, and so much else. So we wanted to see where women ranked 20 years later. And we teamed up with Melinda Gates and the Gates Foundation, with the Clinton Foundation, to do this study, which was very revealing. It was mostly positive and hopeful. But it was still filled with incidents and examples of where women were held back. And of course, one of the biggest problems in sub-Saharan Africa, something you've addressed, was child marriage and ending a girl's education, marrying her off often at some risk to her health, and not really seeing her as anything other than a worker within the family unit. And so we came out with recommendations. We've been trying to follow that ever since. But data is important. It's not everything. It doesn't tell you how to feel. It doesn't give you the emotional lift that you need to make the arguments. But if you don't know where you are, you can't figure out where you're going. And I think one of the marks of authoritarian regimes is to begin to undermine the database of a country, to begin to muddle the numbers about everything from education to healthcare and the like, and also to quit collecting numbers. And we're having a big argument about that right now in America because the Trump administration wants to either avoid another census, which by Constitution they can't, they're supposed to do it every 10 years, but then to tilt it. So you've got to get the data, but then the data is only a base on which you build political action and also advocate for individual and community change.
Mm-hmm. You spoke very warmly about your visit to Northern Ireland with Bill, and I remember you coming from that visit to Northern Ireland to Dublin, and I remember how impressed you were with women in Northern Ireland. We talked in particular about one woman that we both knew, and unfortunately she died, Agnes McCormack. Do you remember how powerfully she not only worked in Northern Ireland, but also worked with the trade union movement in the States?
Well, Inez was a great voice to end the Troubles, but as Mary said, she was an active trade unionist, and she was advocating for the rights of workers, both men and women. And out of that work, she became very committed to organizing women, along with some other extraordinary leaders who came out of their homes from the grassroots to make sure a woman's voice was heard in the negotiations over how to end the Troubles. And Inez was just a great friend of mine. She was a live wire, as you know, and I remember coming to the president's home, Bill and I, to meet with you and to meet Nick and to talk about what we had seen in Northern Ireland, because of course Ireland was critical to the success of the Good Friday Agreement.
And I remember we went out to plant a tree, which is a normal thing for a head of state, and Bill asked me on the way, why haven't you accepted my invitation for a state visit? And I said, what invitation? And he said, leave it with me. And he publicly said it later. So I remember that very well. But getting back just to Agnes for a moment, you know, what she did subsequently was very innovative. It was to use international human rights to build up community human rights in Belfast and in Northern Ireland. And she had wonderful groups, and she was linking with groups in Dublin. And it was just so innovative, and you know, it was an incredible effort by a very fine friend of both of us, who's well worth remembering on an occasion like this. Now, you came to visit Nick and myself in Áras an Uachtaráin. I would say we had 7 very happy years in Áras an Uachtaráin. You had 8 years in the White House. What was your funniest moment, or at least the funniest moment, the funniest moment you're willing to share with us?
Well, how much time do we have? You know, as you know from your time as president, the house in which you live is not your house. It's a state building, but you want to make it as homey as possible, and you want to encourage people to come, but you also really want to work to make sure your family feels like it's a home. So early on in the time we were there, my daughter was not feeling well, and so before I lived in the White House, I knew exactly what to do, which was to make some soft scrambled eggs and a piece of toast and maybe some applesauce. So there's a little tiny kitchen, which is not it wasn't at that time a working kitchen, on the second floor where the president and his family live. And so I was rummaging around. You know, we'd been there maybe, I don't know, 3 weeks. And I was rummaging around looking for pots and pans and anything I could use. And really, there wasn't much there. So I called down to the kitchen. And I asked if they could bring me some eggs and some bread and some apples. Well, nobody had ever asked them that before. So the first thing they did was to report it up the line to their superiors. And then the superiors reported it to the Secret Service. And the Secret Service sent it up to the line, and I couldn't figure out what was taking so long. I didn't think it would be that big a problem to equip me with enough to make a very simple little repast for my ill daughter. Oh, it went on for at least an hour. I would call back down. They said, just a minute, ma'am, we're coming. And, you know, what does that mean? Does that mean that she wants to cook for herself? Nobody's ever done that. Of course I didn't want to cook for myself. So, I mean, that was one of the first of many, many funny. The only other thing I would say is that when you live in a house surrounded by people who are there to serve you, and that's something they take very seriously and feel a great deal of respect for. So if you casually say something, like my husband one morning said, you know, could you leave some bananas up here? I love to have like a banana. He was into running and...
bananas weren't too bad for him.
Yeah, bananas weren't so bad. And so all of a sudden, like there's trees of bananas everywhere you turn. And it goes on and on. But so many, many funny things, but a wonderful experience otherwise.
I remember you giving quite a witty remark, or a response to a question asked of, you know, when was the last time you went out without being recognized? Do you remember that? Will you tell that story?
Well, there are a couple of those. I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but let me tell this one. Because, again, early on, if you've ever been to Washington, you see where the White House is, and there's a little park in front of it called Lafayette Park, and then across the park, there's a hotel called the Hay Adams, a distinguished old hotel. So, again, this couldn't have been much beyond, March. So we inaugurated late January, so about a month or so afterwards. And so I thought, it's a beautiful, crisp day. I'm going to walk. Well, that too poses all kinds of problems. But I finally worked it through the bureaucracy that I could walk to this meeting that was being held at the Hay Adams. And I'm walking out the gate, and it used to be, you know, so much has changed after 9/11, very sadly, but it used to be that there'd be photographers there, and they would have these paper cutouts of the president and the vice president, the first lady, and you could stand there and take pictures. Some of you may have done that. So I'm walking out, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my face on top of this figure. And then I do a double take. And I'm looking, and I thought, I don't own that blazer. I don't have that skirt or those shoes. And I realized they had taken Barbara Bush's body, and you know they didn't have a new one made yet, so they had stuck my face, and it was like, what is going on?
Well, the story that I was expecting was that that you were out walking in the woods one day, and I think a jogger came past you.
Yeah. Well, people I would try to go out with a baseball cap on and sunglasses. And again, this was pre-9/11, so I persuaded the Secret Service that, you know, I could walk fast. I'd put on, you know, like workout clothes, jogging clothes, something like that. And I would go out, I'd walk the mall, or I'd go along the river, the canal in Georgetown, sometimes take a bike. And so people... I remember one time I was walking really fast, and somebody yelled, "Ma'am, ma'am!" And I thought, oh dear, they recognized me. I turned around, and this family was standing there, tourists to Washington. They said, "Could you take our picture?" Sure, absolutely. Or some of my other favorites is, you know, you'd be out, and I'd be trying to, you know, get my exercise, and somebody would come and say, "You look just like Hillary Clinton." And I took to saying, I've heard that before.
And that still isn't the one I was expecting. The one I was expecting is the one where this woman jogger passes you, and then she runs back and she warns you.
Yes. Okay,
you're being followed by 2 men.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That was when I was Secretary of State, and I used to, you know, late at night, when I'd get home from work or home from travel, I would take a walk, and yes, exactly as Mary said. So I was on the sidewalk, and a woman was on a bike, and she had a little light on her bike, and she passes me, and she stops, and she walks backwards, and she says to me, "I think I should tell you you're being followed by 2 men." And I said, "Oh, really?" You know, knowing that they were the Secret Service. But anyway, that's the kind of strange stuff that goes on.
Alas, I've got the signal from Linda that our conversation is at an end, but it has been a great pleasure to have you here in Trinity. It will be an enormous pleasure to honour you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.